I am Chris.
And I'm Matt.
Welcome to Roleplay Chat.
We are two game masters who can't stop talking about role-playing games.
And today we talk about the pros and cons of railroading and sandboxing and a way for you to find this perfect balance.
And as always, we're going to focus in on the role-playing elements so that we can get better at roleplay together.
The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through, we're going to define the terms through the pros and cons of the extreme version of each. So we're going to do extreme railroading first, and then extreme sandbox, giving examples, and then that's going to be our kind of a definition. So let's start with railroading.
Yeah, so one of the big pros and conversely one of the cons of railroading is that players don't need to make any choices. It's, they're just there and their choices don't really matter. And that's kind of both sides of the coin here. Another element is the fact that the game is focused. It's got a purpose, it's got intention, but the flip side is that it's very linear. It can feel one-dimensional because of it.
Game masters that really like railroading usually are more narrative. They like to tell a story. They're really storytellers who have an end game in mind, and that's kind of the way they can bring the story towards that end game. But on the con side, the problem is for the players, if that's not done right, it can feel very artificial and kind of less realistic, maybe over the top even, depending on what's the story.
Another element is that, in terms of positives, is that the players get to be more passive in the way that they play. They can spectate, sit back, almost be like at the movies and enjoy the show. The con associated to this is that the game master controls everything. This can mean more work on the game master, but it could also mean, again, the players don't have a whole lot to say, and the game master is the master puppeteer of the whole thing.
If the game master controls a little bit more in railroading, it also allows, as a pro, to control the pacing, have cliffhangers, have big surprises, control the up and the down. If you're interested about pacing, we have a video that we can link up there about pacing and how to control it. But for that, you need to have some control. The con of this is that the player may feel pushed regardless of what they're doing. They might want to spend more time in the marketplace, but we're pushing them forward in order to achieve that pacing.
And lastly, something that's commonly associated with a railroad game is focused GM prep. The game master knows where the game is going, so they can just focus in and zero in on that and not worry about everything else. In terms of a negative, obviously if the game master is only focusing in on one thing, the player's choices clearly don't affect what's going on. So I hope that, guys, gives you a good idea of what a railroad game in its purest only railroad form can be. Now let's shift the exercise onto a sandbox game. We're going to use the same concept here, 100% sandbox. Chris, can you kick us off? What is one of the big pros of a sandbox?
In the sandbox game, the game master acts as a referee, and you can create a very open world, something massive. That's when you get those massive worlds that maybe railroading is not as conducive to. On the other hand, the problem is if you make that big open world, it can be very overwhelming for players, for specific types of players especially, to just know where to go and to get something done. Too many NPCs, too many locations, and not enough direction.
Yeah, and that basically bleeds in to the next pro, is that the game master doesn't dictate or give any direction to the players. So if you're a player who likes that freedom, that's a big plus. The downside to that, though, is that how do you know what to focus on if the game master is giving you no direction?
Players can explore everything. That's a pro. They can explore the world, and that can be very rewarding by itself. But also keep in mind that this might be very intensive for the prep. Like the prep takes a long time to do in a railroad game. In a sandbox game, if you want to prep all the dimension the players can go.
Now, here we're going to enter into some pros that will be accentuated if your players are decisive and are very experienced. But the flip side is if you have more passive players or players who lack experience, they might struggle with some of these. So one of the pros here is that the players can direct the story wherever they want it to go. Now, obviously, if the players don't know or don't want to be in charge like that, you can really end up with a pretty bad story with no overarching plot, no kind of, main villain or big story pushing everything forward.
And they drive the pace. So when it slows down, when it goes faster, by their actions. And again, if they don't take action, you have stagnation. And stagnation can be the death of a campaign, even if it's super well built. Like there's a lot to do. They have to actually do it. So that might be a problem.
And if the players are setting the pace and they're making decisions, deciding the story, they're focusing in on the things they want to focus in on. That can be a huge bonus here. But again, the players don't know what to focus on, you kind of fall into the same pitfall, and the game feels like it's lacking direction and focus.
Maybe an anecdote here could be good. I'm creating a game for my brother, and I started very sandboxy. And after a year, they told me there's too much going on. Too much going on. We need you to focus and give us something to go towards, some kind of direction. So there's kind of a common wisdom on the social media that railroading is bad and sandboxing is good and virtuous.
If you look at the table, guys, just considering how many things in the pros for sandboxing have player. The word players get to choose, get to decide, get to focus in on things they want. Obviously, it sounds extremely appealing to a player, no doubt. And if you look at the railroad definition, it seems to be a little bit more controlling. The game master sets the pace. The game master sets the story. Players' choices don't matter. So when asked which one a game master or a player would prefer, often we hear people say they prefer the sandbox alternative. But at the end of the day, neither one of these two in isolation is any good.
So what we're going to do here is we're going to not consider those as being opponent per se, but more part of a spectrum. So on one side, let's say the far left, we have this perfect purist railroad. And on the right side, we have, again, this purist sandbox. And you might have a preference there, but think of it of a continuous line. And what we're going to encourage you is to take a little bit of what we said here. And the terms railroad and sandbox have their own history, let's say. But think of railroad as the game master agency in the story, and the sandbox being the player agency in the story.
So looking at it in this lens allows you to really build something out of this conversation, right? If you look at it with the old definitions of Sandbox and Railroad, you might not really get anything out of it. But what I'm encouraging you to do is to look at this spectrum and try to figure out where exactly you lie. If you're allowing your players to make choices, you might lie closer to the sandbox where the player agency is king. But if you're still directing and giving purpose and flow to the whole adventure that's taking place, you are railroading to a certain extent. It doesn't have to be a bad word to call your game a railroaded campaign.
No, think of it as you are also a part of the story, and the game master puts interrupts, has even an idea of where maybe the players would go. When you have an idea of where they go and you put challenges to go towards that, you are giving direction, but it's your agency. You're the game master acting. Mm-hmm. So that's no longer a sandbox. A sandbox would mean the game master is only a referee and he's very removed from the story. So how can that be actually helpful? So that's the spectrum. Like Matt said, it's good to situate yourself in it. And even from one campaign to the other, if you're the game master, the style might change. So keep that in mind. And also, it could be a good indication to your players to tell them, again, set expectation maybe in session 0, or even right now, if you didn't do it yet, is telling them, here's the amount of choices, here's the space you're going to have for your player choices.
And if you don't know, that's fine. Because we're going to give you I don't want to call it a formula, because it's not that, but a way for you to at least test things out to figure out where you lie on the spectrum and where on the spectrum your party ought to find itself in. So what you're going to do is in your next game, hopefully it's in an environment where you can initiate something new. You're going to start off very railroaded. You're going to tell your players as such. You're going to tell them, hey guys, I'm going to give you guys a mission. Maybe you're going to start them halfway through that mission. You know, you're already in the dungeon. You're already with the treasure in hand. Now you got to get out. That's pretty railroady. That's okay.
So that's kind of how we said to start a campaign too. If you've seen our video about starting campaigns, it's starting with the action, starting a little bit railroady. So you start with a clear objective, maybe some kind of time pressure and some crisis that needs to be addressed now. The players usually don't get to just be like, no, I'm not doing that, right? So it's some kind of crisis that they have to do. And then as the game advances and this crisis gets resolved, maybe make the time a little bit longer. They have more time to be creative with their choices on how to fix the problem and more and more.
Or who to engage with to fix the problem. And time is only one of these variables. Sometimes the solution can be as creative as the players want, and in all honesty, it should always be as creative as the players want. But here, you're giving them the flexibility to explore and interact with different elements of your game that maybe you didn't have as part of that linear story that you had originally in your more railroad form. And as you move forward, as these decisions are made by the players, the game is going to start to break apart. And not break apart, the game is going to start to break from that railroad and into something that's more of a sandbox.
So the goal here is to fill the space. You want a game that the space is filled. So instead of going sandboxy where you might have this stagnation and this empty space of no decision, we suggest starting to the left, close to the railroad, and moving your way towards this, letting the players take their space as you free it. And at one point, they won't need more space, and you'll find that perfect balance. And you might be surprised where it ends up being. And what's going to happen is you're going to learn how to do what we call branching. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Matt.
Yes. So branching is somewhere along this spectrum. For Chris and I think it's somewhere along the lines of 80% railroad, or maybe 70% railroad, 30% sandbox. And what it is the game master still is controlling the flow of the narrative. Picture a tree growing out of the ground, and at the bottom of the tree is where our adventure begins. There's one trunk, and it's growing upward. That's the initial railroad that we discussed. But as the players start to make choices, and as the players find themselves at a turning point, they branch off.
Those branching points are decision making for your players. Maybe your players are just going to go through the main branch you've prepared, and that's perfectly fine. Your players are probably a little bit more passive. But maybe your players are going to go left and right and all over the place, go back down and go back up, and that's also a very interesting campaign. But having those branches mean it's not just a sandbox with no direction. They have something to go on. So that's what we suggest.
Yeah, and something that's fun is when you start to tie in players' objectives and players' purpose towards this main narrative. That's when players having objectives becomes important. If your players don't have those, I suggest you send them this video that we shot a couple of weeks ago on how to set objectives as a player. It certainly helped me out just talking about it. So I'm sure it'll help your players out too.
And I think that's about it for today on railroading and branching. And sorry, railroading, yeah, sure, railroading, branching, sandboxing, all of that.
Yeah, so if you have questions, comments, or thoughts, we encourage you to do so by commenting down below or reaching out to us. You can reach out on Twitter, that's at roll_play_chat.
Or we have an email, that's contactroleplaychat@gmail.com.
If you like this video, we also encourage you to like and subscribe to the channel. We try to put something out every couple of weeks. And we also have a podcast that you could listen into. Just look up for Roleplay Chat wherever you listen to podcasts. And with that, we will close the show. Thanks for the chat, Chris.
Thanks, Matt.
Let's call it a chat.